Dan, I want to start off with this. I think film is one of those things that is un unintentionally complex. I think it's just one of those things that on the surface can be entertainment and simple to take in, but I think every film to an extent has a kind of deeper meaning or context. And as someone who has studied films, I kind of want you to give us just some background. Tell us who you are and how you got into the philosophy of film and all of that.
hmm Okay, sure. I mean, as far as like my getting into philosophy goes, it was a lot of the kind of usual questions people have, like, why are we here? What counts as knowledge? Why do people accept received opinions so readily? Um, and, that sense of like questioning things as they were, and how people readily just kind of took them on was this really important kind of motivation for me to kind of get into philosophy. And I originally thought that I would pair it with majoring in a science. But I gave that up pretty quickly because I realized that science didn't answer the questions that I really wanted to address,
Yeah.
and that philosophy did. So, thinking about things like, you know, um, why do we act in the way that we do? Why do we appreciate beautiful things, or other kinds of artworks, so much? Why do they affect us? That all seems to be this um, really, there was this fascinating sort of thing. And, as far as leading to my study of film goes, that was kind of an extended process. So, um, when I started out, I liked films and I liked philosophy, but they were kind of two separate things.
Yeah.
And gradually I realized, well, people are beginning to study film philosophically. And, this is Stanley Cavell and then the work of Noel Carroll. And gradually I realized that I could sort of combine those two interests, which were very strong in my life. And once I finished my dissertation, I kind of gave myself permission. Okay, I'm going to write about these films that have really interested me intensely, which were like these African American film noirs that were
Yeah.
coming in the early 1990s. And those films made me think, film can be used to make you think about race. And then I realized that those films can make you think about race philosophically. And that was again this kind of stretched out process over several years where I realized not only can film and philosophy be combined, but also that film and philosophy and race can be combined. And, this is something that happened through, roughly speaking, the 80s, the 1980s and 1990s. Um, and so the first thing I published on like philosophy, film, and race actually came out in about 2000. And I realized that's really what I wanted to do. So I just pursued that. I've pursued that since.
Yeah, and that's one of the main things I wanted to talk about. When I looked at your published works, I realized quickly that you spent a lot of your academic and, writing career looking at race and film and its intersections. And I kind of wanted to ask, was there a specific movie or moment that made you realize that you could study film philosophically while also looking at race?
Um, was there a specific film? And I've been going back and forth about this. I mean, exactly one film, no.
Mm,
but a bunch of films, yes. And so what um like film scholar Ed Guerrero calls the new black film wave, which was this, bunch of films that were being made by African American filmmakers in the late 80s and early 1990s. They kind of gave me this sense of how film could get you to, again, think about race, but also think about race philosophically. And again, it wasn't one particular film or moment. But there were moments,
mm,
so like Do the Right Thing was deeply troubling to me watching that in 1989 and then I don't know how many other times since then. Um, was this moment of, you know, a film that really made me think about what it was to be white, for example.
yeah.
I gradually got this sense of, well, being white has this quality to it that I in many ways instantiated, um, that was kind of callous toward race and problems of race. And there are all these ways in which, like white people can kind of explain away why they shouldn't think deeply about race. And Do the Right Thing kind of made me think about that partly through the character of Sal.
Mm, yeah.
So that's kind of one moment, but it wasn't like it wasn't like an epiphany until I'd seen that film a number of times and I'd thought about it in connection with a bunch of other films. And again, I mean these African American film noirs like One False Move and Deep Cover made me realize there was a depth to how you could make films from an African American perspective that could trouble whites in this really interesting way. Of course, it can also trouble lots of non-whites too. And but I mean, because it seemed to me that most non-whites probably already had a sense of this.
Yeah.
Interesting that these films could get whites to think about that. And one example is at the end of the movie Deep Cover, the main character says to the audience, because he's doing a voiceover narration, what would you do, had you been in my position? And it's clearly meant to make you think much more deeply than just about that character's particulars. It's rather meant to make you think about what about all these issues of race and how that impinges on um, Black masculinity, for example,
Yeah.
to kind of shepherd them into criminality because of all the presumptions made about, you know, um, male blackness. And I thought that was this really interesting way to get people to think philosophically about race. And of course, there were the other films like I said, One False Move already. I also thought Menace to Society was a really jolting film,
It is.
because you follow this character all the way through and you realize at the last moment that he's narrating this from the grave, so to speak. And he's a character who is incredibly deeply flawed, but who at the same time you care deeply about. And that, how do you reconcile that as well as, the way in which he, again, is kind of shepherded into criminality by his social conditions. And all those, and Clockers, Spike Lee's Clockers, they all kind of were contemplative films, I thought, or at least lent themselves pretty easily to contemplation in a way that I think people were, at least some people, were kind of motivated to think philosophically.
Yeah. It's one of those things that's interesting too, because I think over time its appreciation has changed. I think one of the main culprits, I think, has been social media. I think being able to see, back in the 80s and 90s, it was film, yes, and is it now? Yes, but also I think being able to go onto Instagram, uh, X, formerly Twitter, and all these other different platforms and see people our age, but from different races, and see like how they think about the world and why they believe the things that they do.
Yes.
And one thing that I think is more presenting now is the ability to show that culture of whatever race it may be through art on social media. And I wonder, and I bring this up because I wonder if you studying film within race and philosophy has changed as technology has evolved, And I kind of wonder, has it changed from watching those movies of the 80s and 90s to seeing those films of the 2010s and 2020s?
Well, it's certainly changed as the films have changed. So going into the 2000s and 2010s and 2020s, I think that those more recent filmmakers like Ryan Coogler, for example,
Yeah.
and Barry Jenkins have both been able to build on what these older filmmakers like Spike Lee and Carl Franklin um, have been able to do earlier. And I think that's this really interesting thing. Then that's all within film itself. But one thing they have at least learned from that wasn't around, say, 30 years ago is social media. And if you take like Ryan Coogler's first film, Fruitvale Station, as an example, well, one reason why people knew about the victim depicted in that film is through social media. His death was shown on social media because people recorded it on their phones. And again, I mean, when George Floyd was killed, his death was recorded on social and broadcast on social media. And that brought about all these protests and things like that. And what that I think means is knowledge about these kinds of things is much more available, much more quickly. And in some ways, you don't have to do as much hard work for some people to get them to care about that sort of thing. I mean, the one of the things that I think we're seeing now with social media is there's this enormous split, right? Where you have some people who, and especially younger people, to be honest,
Mm,
who are very sympathetic to problems of race and who want to kind of make things better. And one way to do that is to both appreciate and to create various kinds of social media. You have older groups that are resistant to that, as well as pockets of younger people too. And their resistance is partly predicated on their inability to take in critiques of race, in particular critiques of whiteness.
mm,
And I mean, some of that boils down to a resistance to desiring to reflect on oneself, and
mhm.
think that you're not somehow, I don't know, untouched by race, right?
Yeah.
And and the interesting thing that I think a lot of more recent social media and film and television, for example, have been able to get across is race affects who we are much more deeply than, say, people 30 or more years ago were thinking about. And so the kind of revolutionary stuff that people were doing, say, in the late 80s and early 1990s is much more accessible now and people can cotton on to it, I think, more easily. Um, so that social media has had a huge influence on lots of things. Um, Admittedly, I am not much a part of that. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't have much of a social media presence, and I, see vicariously things on Instagram and X and things like that. Um, but I know that it's out there, and I know that people are being affected by it in a way that honestly think lots of other people can write about much better than I can. Um, One other thing that I'll mention is, this has also crept into video games
Mm,
and even quite popular ones like Grand Theft Auto, for example, the later versions where you have like the protagonist who is in some ways based on the the African American character in Miami Vice,
mm, yeah.
and that, you know, giving people an idea of what it's like to live his life as, through, playing him as an avatar in a game can also have a kind of effect on one's racial consciousness. Doesn't have to, but it certainly can. And it's affected at least some people.
Yeah, I mean, I th it's very interesting that you bring up video games as well, because I can remember very vividly around the time that those later games came out, Grand Theft Auto 4 and especially Grand Theft Auto 5, articles and videos that came out, not particularly on more of the race side of it, but more particularly on the inciting violence that maybe it had on actual real life events.
Mhm.
And so it kind of makes you wonder, what other things have an effect on why we think the things that we think and why we do the things that we do. And I think, the simple answer is that it's everything.
Yeah,
Everything does.
yeah,
Every single thing, the things that we read, the things that we watch, the things that we, I don't know, eat even, and the
mhm,
advertisements we see for it.
yeah.
And I kind of wanted to go back for a second back to film and race, but one thing I kind of wanted to ask, especially talking about, films going to video games and kind of seeing that everything can affect us.
Mhm.
What's one idea that you've kind of gained from writing about, these complex intersections that you wish people knew more or thought about more that kind of influence ourselves and the things that we think?
Well, I guess one idea that I've written about some more recently is the effect that you get from implicit biases and implicit attitudes. And it partly comes from my training in philosophy, which is largely about knowledge and high level cognition and stuff like that. And what's neglected in philosophy is the affective and embodied side of life. And this is a critique that not only feminist thinkers have made, but also some critical philosophers of race. And what's interesting is that you can talk about, as you say, everything affecting us and how we are, for example, racially. And it goes all the way down to the way in which one is raised. And that becomes, like that includes these things that small children, for example, pick up on, as well as, more mature individuals, but like gestures and reactions. I mean, one thing that philosopher George Yancey talks about is how sometimes when he was younger, he would notice that walking down the street, people would lock their car doors in anticipation that he might like run into their car and try to steal it or something in it. And this idea of kind of an automatic reaction that many people had to him was this, like really interesting and important element of what it is to be raised in the United States, for example. And so, whites think about, well, you're in a bad neighborhood, you should lock your car doors. There's a racial aspect to that oftentimes. And similarly, for people of color who are living in those neighborhoods, their feeling of how whites react to them is very much conditioned by the kinds of unconscious reactions that whites have to them. But when you talk about children, okay, who are being raised, say, by those white parents, they very much pick up on those cues and adopt them almost automatically because their primary caregivers are instructing them in some sense how to navigate the social world by means of those kinds of cues and biases and attitudes. And I've written a little bit about that um, in stuff more recently, like in the last 10 years or so. And I think that's something that needs to be explored a lot more than um, like rationalistic arguments for why race is bad, because I
Yeah.
think that those have been well articulated. And it's clear that rationally speaking, you shouldn't be racist, right? But in the embodied sense of being white, or even in many ways non-white, reacting negatively to race remains this kind of underexplored aspect of how it is that we respond to race, both in real life and to film and to TV and video games and social media even.
Mm.
And so it has this pervasive effect on us that, we've scratched the surface about, but needs to be explored much more carefully, I think. And some newer art is doing that, I think. I mean, lots of Black artists and artists of color are able to kind of get at those things now much more readily than than I think artists who were working decades ago.
Yeah, and I like how you bring it up that art nowadays, some of the newer artists have begun to do that because I think one of the main reasons why that might be is because I would make an assumption that those artists are fairly younger in a sense, and so I think what they have done now is that they've kind of grown up with the childhood that they've had, and not to say that they're the first ones to do this, but I think they're the first ones to kind of look back and see those preconceived notions about them or the preconceived notions that they've had about other people through, put on them through their parents or caregivers, guardians, whoever it may be, and put it into what they make.
Yes.
I think they're some of the first to do that. And I think I'm going to bring this up again because I think it's, one of the main things that I think can also do this is through social media. I think one of the main ways that I think some of the main ways that people and even people within the same race can, relate and communicate with each other is by creating, videos, arts, or even memes that kind of share these cultural or racial experiences that they've had. And I think, and I think the truth is that I think white people just haven't had to experience that as much. They just haven't. Not to
Yes.
say that they can't, but I just don't think they've realized it.
Yes. And part of that's because, we still largely live, certainly in the US, but also worldwide, in segregated communities,
Yeah.
or segregated neighborhoods, and they're de facto segregated. I mean, it's not like the old days where there were covenants that, were basically laws. Those are all mostly gone by the wayside now. But you have traditional kind of ways of living that live on. And, I mean, I grew up in a small town, for example, in Minnesota, that I realized decades later must have had a racial covenant because when I was growing up, there was one Puerto Rican family and one Native American family living in the entire town. And so, the my experience with growing up with, kids and stuff was like virtually everybody was white. And, of course, it's changed. There's, much more mixing and things, but not as much as one would think, because there are still enclaves of whiteness. There's still enclaves of people of color. And it's a challenge still to transgress those for a million reasons. And that means that we pick up on how people are reacting around us in ways that are de facto racialized.
Yeah, and I think as time goes on, I think we're just going to become more hyper aware of it. I think you know, throughout more and more creation of content and art, film, television, photographs, I think we come and writing, I think we just become more hyper aware of the things that we just maybe didn't notice when we were younger, or even that older generations didn't notice at all.
Yeah. Or noticed and denied.
Yeah, and denied for various multifaceted reasons that, that can have entire research projects on their own. And
Yeah.
I think it can all be kind of traced back to, I mean, and actually before I get into that, I kind of wanted to touch on like how, like, yes, segregation still, I think, manifests itself in different shapes and forms. Not through the bounds of maybe, you know, I think when people think of segregation, they think of, the 1950s and 60s with, uh, you know, black restrooms and white restrooms, but I think it's more maybe of a class thing now and maybe bounds to history. You know,
Yes.
m most of the African American population in the United States lives in the South,
Hmm.
and I think that's empirically bound to history. And so I just yeah I just find it interesting how like the evolution of something like segregation has just kind of evolved, and it's just it's just in different shapes and forms now. And 20, 40, 60 years later, I think it's going to be different again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to just blame the South because it's also
Yeah,
North, So like
yeah,
in that city I lived in for 20 years, Minneapolis, I mean, the main population of African Americans is in North Minneapolis and then certain parts of South Minneapolis. And there are whole neighborhoods where, you can find some people of color, but it's dominated by, whites living there. And, that has historical roots in like, what is it called? Redlining.
mm,
And those things are still sort of not enforced, but they influence how people think about where they might live and things like that.
yeah.
And of course, big cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, so on, they also have kind of lots of, again, de facto segregated neighborhoods. And, it has to do with history and the way in which people act, just roughly speaking, socially,
Yeah.
will, you know. Um, but here, again, I mean, art, social media, film can have a kind of positive influence on people and get them to think about race not only with, more awareness, but also more depth. And again, I mean, the more recent stuff, I think, seems to be able to reach more deeply. And it's probably because artists and filmmakers and social media people, creators, um, have been educated in this. I mean, a lot of Black artists have taken Black studies courses.
Yeah.
And, like Chicano artists have taken Chicano studies classes. They know about these things in a way that wasn't possible, um, say 50, 60 years ago. And that makes a difference in what they're able to put into their art. Um, and I'm encouraged by that. At the same time, I'm really horrified by the kind of negative and vehement reactions against it that have occurred as well. But I mean, you go back to the 50s and 60s and the civil rights era then, and there was similarly this negative reaction, you know, that was strong and vehement and violent. Um, and so it's not, in some ways, it shouldn't be a surprise, even though it's shocking, that there is resistance because, you know, these are big changes being proposed by these, artists and filmmakers. And the big changes are going to mean enormous differences in people's lives. And some people just don't want to change.
Yeah, it's fascinating, especially within, I would say, higher education within the United States that, 15, 25 years ago, maybe you wouldn't be able to take a class on, you know, Chicano art or black hip hop. It just wasn't something that was considered something to have a class or study for.
It wasn't even considered, I
Y-
mean, in the case of hip hop, it wasn't even considered music. Some people
Yeah,
thought it was just noise.
noise, yeah. And I find it fascinating how now, when even when I sign up for classes, there are classes where I'm like, oh, they have a class on that now. That's pretty cool. And also to agree with what you said earlier, I find it absolutely uh I don't even know what word to use. I find it absolutely astonishing that people might push back against that to have some type of control or monopoly on what people can learn. And but to go back, I think it's interesting too how now those classes exist and those studies exist. And you know, I think one of the main reasons why I think this has occurred is just through, I mean, once again, I'm going to bring it up, but I just think the popular influence of these cultures and their art on 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 more broadly American culture through social media. I mean, it is without a doubt, um, it is, how do I say this? It's like it's impossible to not recognize the influence that for example, black culture has had on America. Even now,
Hmm. Yeah.
and that's just one example of all the different types of cultures and arts that have had an influence nowadays. And so I think that's one of the main reasons why now, you can have a class on, you know, black hip hop music because now you can find hip hop music everywhere. I think it's I can confidently assume that I think it's the most popular genre of music nowadays. I believe it is, and I kind of wondered, to go back and see the kind of rise of these cultures and their arts. What do you think is one thing that you've kind of seen throughout all of them within, the past 20 years that you can kind of look at and be like, what has this kind of given to, let's say students who now can study it and take classes on it?
Uh, I mean, I think that the greater awareness academically of the kinds of influences that are just pervasive in human life is really important. And the freedom to study that has been hugely important too. I mean, the whole idea that you might be able to study, say, African American film like I came to study is this really important possibility, as is, the possibility of studying hip hop, which again, was not thought of even as music originally, its cultural influence. I have a colleague who looks at social media and race more than I do. And you know, she has a much better sense of like
Mm.
the kinds of influences going on there. But I mean, all these possibilities are really crucial. And it has to do with like years of scholarship that build on each other that indicate that um, this is these are legitimate subjects to study in academia because they do have this deep, deep influence on us. And so is there one single thing? I mean, in a sense, broadly speaking, academic freedom is really important.
Yeah.
Um, Another is that I suppose, I'm kind of one of those let a thousand flowers bloom kind of folks in terms of like what people should be able to study in academia. Um, and so, the study of African American music, for example, or the study of influences of, say, Caribbean music on American popular music, or the roots of blues and jazz for, practically all American popular culture and music in particular in the last 150 years now. Those are all really important things to be able to study. And it's much easier to do that now than it was, 50 years ago, for example. In the last 20 years, I'm still trying to like focus more on that. I mean, honestly, I think one of the things that's actually buttressed all this is work in cognitive science, where people talk about implicit attitudes, the implicit attitude tests and studying cognitive psychology to give us even more kind of deeply grounded insight into um, how we react in ways that are racialized. And and what it means is it's not just arts and humanities that have been affected by this, it's the sciences as well. And that kind of dissemination is something you certainly see in the last 20 years or so. Um, and that's, I think, all to the good because philosophers, like me, will use it for as kind of um, fertilizer for our theorization. And that's something that's of much more recent origin, the thinking about, well, how is it our very psychology is affected um, by race, and and that's still in its kind of infancy in some ways.
Yeah.
But there are people like Claude Steele, for example, who've been talking about this for decades. Um, he came up with stereotype threat,
Mm.
the idea that if you think you're of a certain group that traditionally has been thought to be sort of inferior, that might well affect your performance on
Mm,
tests, for example. And I mean, you know, the easiest is, you know, like a math teacher handing out math exams and turning to, you know, a young woman and saying, well, because you're a girl, I don't expect you to do as well on this exam as the boys, you know.
mm,
That's likely to make female students perform worse.
mm.
But that's easily generalizable to lots of different groups, I think.
Yeah.
And again,
Yeah.
that's much more recent than some of these other things.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's kind of striking to me is kind of like how much um these forms of art can be powerful ways to explore certain things.
Mhm.
So, you know, I mean, the main thing I kind of want to just, just shoot at you is film, right? Because I mean, you've looked at film a lot, and with the amount of time that you've spent looking at race and film, I kind of wonder, you know, your answer to this, but wh why do you think film is such a powerful way to explore these topics?
It is a multimodal medium, you know.
Yeah,
I mean, it is sound and image, and it is touch. Now, touch we don't usually associate with film, but with the advent of like really good stereo systems, you feel in a movie theater or when watching a movie now, as well as hearing it and seeing it. And all those things affect you in not just intellectual ways, but in embodied ways. And so you can be deeply affected by an art um, form like film in ways that are deeper than, or in some ways, like more complicated and more affecting than, say, painting or perhaps music alone. Um, I mean, I think music is really powerful because again, you get both oral sort of, you know, hearing related dimensions and also feeling dimensions. But you can incorporate that into film as well as like narrative and our kind of seemingly innate interest in human beings, um, so that film becomes this really powerful medium that combines and kind of comes at us in a bunch of different ways. But that makes films deceptively complicated. You mentioned this earlier. Um, they're they're complex in ways that we, I think, have traditionally greatly underestimated. And they can affect us in ways that we can't even be fully conscious of. You know, we can parse it out and kind of maybe after the fact kind of articulate all the ways in which it affects us. But movies can give us a sense of the world when we don't have any sense of that world at all, you know. And I mean this goes back to like my interest in African American film perhaps because it gave me a sense of a world that I didn't have much experience of. And it was one of the things that interested me in African American film. And I realized it was giving me a perspective not only on a world, but also on a, a way of life, and a culture that I hadn't had much exposure to. And it made me think about, in many ways, the human condition and how my sense of the human condition was white, you know,
yeah,
this really crude way. And that in that sense, it was inadequate because, whites only represent a small fraction of the global population. And yet, whites have this huge dominance in terms of culture and in terms of art and well as science and religion and all these other things,
Everything.
politics, economy, things like that. And so that made me question, well, maybe there's something flawed and inadequate about how I think about the world in this kind of broadly kind of existential way. And I think that's true, that it was inadequate. And I've spent sort of my academic career as well as my life trying to make up for those sort of shortcomings of how I, you know, kind of was raised to think about the world and how to feel at home in it. And again, I mean, you can get those senses with movies, with television shows in a lot of ways, and with social media and video games in ways that kind of affect us um, in much deeper ways. But the one thing, I've been talking about the advantages of um, how all these different things can get us to have greater awareness of race. Unfortunately, they can also work in the opposite way. They can get us to think less broadly about race because we can curry and kind of manage or have managed for us how we consume moving images, for example, and music and all these other things. And, that's a kind of negative dimension, especially of social media, that also needs to be recognized that, it can take us off on tangents and that can be really, really pernicious and affect us in morally negative ways. And we don't need to explore this anymore. I just want to recognize that, you know,
Yeah.
these things can cut both ways. And, we want to encourage a kind of more positive use of those things, but they can also kind of affect us in contrary ways as well.
Yeah, one thing that you said just a little bit ago that I loved was that the fact that, we can grow up in small communities with you know, with a dominant with a domination of who we are, growing up in a small town that's predominantly white and, you're white. And I think what films can do is that, just like you were saying, they can allow us to experience what others have experienced that may not be like us from different cultures, different races, different parts of the world.
Yeah.
And one thing I kind of wanted to ask, especially, you being a professor, is, when you come to teach some of these films for whatever reason, whatever films they are, you know, how do you choose the films that you may use in your class or writings to kind of to show people what films can really do and which films can make us think some of these hard and difficult questions that we have in our society.
Yeah. Well, I would say that how I choose them for class differs from how I choose things to write about. I've made this joke with some of my students, but there's some truth in it that when I decide to use a film for class, I want there to be at least one good philosophy article on it.
Yeah.
And then a second philosophy article that talks about something in that film that I find, philosophically interesting. And that's just for ease of use, and like, one film I've shown consistently over a quarter century now teaching philosophy and film is Blade Runner.
Hmm.
And one reason is that it is it lends itself really readily to talking about what the film is doing philosophically, because it's trying to get you to think about what is it to be a human being, what counts as that. And there have been numerous articles written about Blade Runner and how it operates philosophically. So that's actually a very easy film to teach. Um, I know that nowadays a lot of students say, well, it's kind of slow and boring. I usually try to inoculate them to that to say, well, look, I mean, just, you know, look at the kind of world building that it's doing, just visually and orally, and think about the kinds of issues that it raises, particularly later on. So you be patient with it.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, and there's also really, like I said, there's really good philosophy articles on Blade Runner. Um, as far as other films go, I mean, sometimes there's a movie that I think is philosophically interesting, and one reason I I I write about it is I think there should be something on it um, that people can read, critically. And so, you know, films that I write about are often ones that, for some reason, pique my interest. And, you know, typically it's been their racial dimensions. Um, and they can be old or new, depending on what I happen to be watching at the time. Um, my older daughter says that I'll watch almost anything to the end. I won't I very seldom like stop watching something partway through. Um, and she's right about that, unfortunately. And I can be pretty omnivorous about what I watch, but I don't write about a lot of what I watch because it's kind of not that interesting philosophically,
Yeah.
or maybe it's making a point I think has already been made. But there are films that I think really do kind of cut deep in terms of their sort of um, what they offer to people. And I've, you know, this is stuff I haven't even published yet, but the movie Judas and the Black Messiah,
Hmm.
for example, was one film that really piqued my interest. And I have a whole chapter written about it in what I hope is going to be a forthcoming book.
Yeah.
Uh, and there are other films um, like that. I've written about Moonlight and actually
Hmm.
published something on that because I thought that was philosophically interesting. Um, I wrote about Zootopia because I thought here's a children's film that is trying to deal with race. And it does a bunch of really kind of interesting and also troubling things in doing so.
Hmm.
Um, and so I've published something on that. But I mean, I guess I guess I have heuristics, I mean, I tend to watch a lot of African American films. And if it's an African American film noir, I'll really watch it. But whether I write about it depends on whether or not it kind of piques my interest or not. Um, and so it's more kind of intuitive process with what I write about than um, the kind of more instrumentalist way I think about what I'll teach in a class.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask, you know, it is confident to say that in films, race is a huge thing that can be explored and then studied. And you can watch it and take it for it is and write about it. And I
Yeah.
wonder, you know, you've spent a lot of time watching films about race and writing about race within those films and its greater preconceived notions. And I also wonder, are there other topics within films that interest you to write about? One of the main things that I, you know, am interested in is kind of the culture, I think. And I bring this up because I think it's relevant to where we live. But I'm always kind of fascinated by the culture of the mountain western states.
Hmm.
And I kind of and because I think they're so separate than maybe some of the other distinct regions of the United States. And I
Yeah.
wonder, what other topics do you find interesting within films that you might write about? Or is it just race? That's fine too. I just wonder.
Um, well, I have an abiding sort of de facto interest in Westerns. And again, that comes partly from my age because um, when I was a child, like every other TV series was a Western, it seemed
Yeah.
like. And I mean, the other half were police procedurals or comedies, but um, the Westerns were a kind of thing that I knew about just because of the time at which I grew up. And especially the way in which Westerns began to become critical, like in the late 60s with the Italian Westerns from people like Sergio Leone and stuff. And those were really interesting. I mean, and they were exciting, fun films to watch when they first came out. Um, but part of what was interesting about them, not only, but certainly part of what was interesting about them is they were more racially inclusive. Um, and they were kind of critical of Western conventions as well as indulging in them quite deeply. And so I've written some about Westerns. Um, just as Westerns. I've written a little bit about things like No Country for Old Men, which is like a cross between a Western and a film noir and an
Yeah.
action thriller and so on. Um, but that also has to do with my abiding interest in Cormac McCarthy's fiction and reading
Yeah.
all his novels and stuff. But I, you know, again, I mean, you know, I've also written about comedies like Zootopia.
Yeah.
Um, but and I have a certain lens that I bring to all kinds of different films that I watch. And some of it is affected by the fact that I've written a lot about race. And I almost always think about that when I watch movies. Um, but I certainly think there's lots and lots of other stuff to write about. Um, I have a colleague, for example, at another institution actually, who writes about cinematography and race.
Mm.
And I think it's this really interesting thing because, as you might know, traditional three-point lighting is actually a form of lighting, a lighting technique that advantages photographing white people.
Yeah. Yep.
And if you want to photograph people of color, you need like at least 5-point lighting.
Mm.
And you need to think about like um, well, in the old days, film stock, but in the digital age, you got to think about how you kind of play and adjust the colors and skin tones and things like that.
Camera
And
settings now and yeah.
camera settings, yeah.
Yeah.
And all that is something that until, God, man, beginning with like Ernest Dickerson writing about how he like worked with lenses in the late 80s on School Days with Spike Lee, and then like um uh Richard Dyer writing this book called White in 1997, um, talking about how whiteness, the idea of whiteness, has affected photography. Um, you know, people didn't really think about that, and they just thought, people of color looked bad in movies because, and we didn't realize it at the time, I think, or at least most people didn't, that it was because the lighting techniques were not complementary. And all that has changed now in positive but still progressing ways, um, regarding how you photograph non-whites on film or in digital media. And and I think that's important to write about. Um, just the aesthetics of film. I'm in love with movies,
Yeah.
and I love the way they look oftentimes. And so an abiding sort of interest that I have, at least watching films, is, like watching Terrence Malick's movies, especially his early ones.
Mm.
And, he doesn't do much with race, but his films are nonetheless worth thinking about and worth appreciating because they're quite beautiful and they work through mood and kind of tone and atmosphere, so to speak, in ways that I think are fascinating that I haven't really written about, but that I think are really important, and I'm really happy other people write about. Um, and there are lots of other filmmakers like that too. Wes Anderson, who's great fun to watch because of the kind of quirky symmetry and color sort of palette that he uses in his films. Um, and a host of other, you know, people making films too.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how over time I think film aesthetics have been captivated more and more to understand why certain films are portrayed the way that they are,
Yeah,
because they're visual and you can kind of look at them and and what I love about it is that you can just feel it, Sometimes I think it's less more of a logical way of thinking about films and more of just an emotion, which
yes,
which I'm constantly interested in because I think over time, uh, you know, I like in a way I've kind of have grown up in a way to think less emotionally but be more logical with the way that I approach things. And then when I decided to go to school for film, I've kind of had to regain that ability to think more with my emotions and just be like, you know what, I can't even give you a logistical reason. I just feel it. And you can
yeah,
go from there.
yeah.
And one final question I kind of wanted to ask, before we get out of here, is what do you think you would want to see be written more about when it comes to films? Because films can be made about everything and anything on this planet.
Yeah.
What is one thing you think you'd like to see more talked about,
Ah, the way in which we reconcile our intellectual and emotional responses.
Hmm.
And I mean, that's something that we do kind of as a kind of automatic process because, when you think about it, we have this emotional response, say to film, but also to
Yeah.
real life. And then we start thinking about it, if you will, in a more rationalistic, logical fashion.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of check on this quick and dirty assessment that we do emotionally. And oftentimes, the emotional assessment is right. And then other times it's not. Now, we do that when we watch film as well, but film leaves out all the boring parts, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? And so,
Dramatized.
yeah, and I mean, you know, Noel Carroll talks about how films are criterially pre-focused. And what that means is the narrative is constructed so you see only the most interesting parts, or the most interesting parts are emphasized. And I think that's generally right. But it also means that affectively, those films are pre-focused. And so you get this intense sort of emotional experience. And it can be a little bit overwhelming, I think. So that you might just start thinking about a film only after you see it.
Hmm.
But we are constantly reconciling these kind of affective and intellectual ways of perceiving. And, you know, we in general need to know more about that, especially in philosophy. I mean, I tell my students sometimes one thing we forget is that philosophy is love of wisdom. It is this affective thing that we have with respect to our reflective life, which is heavily like intellectual and logical and rational, but it's also emotional. And film sort of is this kind of really interesting instantiation of how it is that we react to real life that incorporates this intense emotional experience along with at least some kind of intellectual stuff that is supposed to make us think. But how we kind of reconcile those things and what might be the best way to reconcile those things, philosophers of film need to write more about that. And I I think that some people are beginning to do that. Um, but, you know, philosophers tend to think intellectually about films, and we've done a lot of good work on that. And I think some people have written about films emotionally, and, a lot of people in film studies and stuff have done that. But bringing those together is something that remains to be done in a really, really thoroughgoing kind of deep way. And that's what I hope people do from now on. And of course, that's going to involve, partly at least, how we respond to race, because that's such a fundamental part of our lives now. I mean, race didn't matter for people living like 50,000 years ago because there was no concept of race, right? I mean, they might have had other tribal hatreds or something, but it wasn't race. But in the modern era, race is this kind of important factor. And so we have to figure out what kind of function it should have in our lives, which is going to be both mental, intellectual, and embodied and affective. And film is this nice sort of place where we can think about those things, I think. And that's where I think we need to think about all that sort of thing more.
Absolutely. I just think it allows sometimes with films especially to create this sort of embodiment of uncomfortable reflections that allow us to understand the world better and also not only the world, but I think the people that live on it that we think we're so different from when we're really not. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Dan, thanks again for coming on here. I really do appreciate it.
sure. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, of course. Um, I'm gonna get out of here. Hope you have a good day.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Um, so do you have like a podcast that you put this on? You have
Yeah. So it's on YouTube, and that's where I've mainly posted to. You can put it on like Spotify and Apple Music. I don't care to do that because I think it costs money, and I don't care enough to do that. Um, but yeah, I just kind of post them on YouTube, and I'll tell you what, I started this with some of my um acquaintances at school, and it was named it was a completely different thing. where we just talked about films that we liked and, why we like them and all that. And that kind of like cascaded and just didn't work because they were my friends. And by the end of the thing, we just were stupid and we weren't even on topic. And so I kind of switched to doing it by myself because I wanted to not only not be distracted, but also kind of combine certain topics that I'm interested in. Because although I do go to school for film and I am a filmmaker and I love that, there are just foundational things about the world that I'm also interested in that have correlation to film. So like what is that, right? And so for me, that's history and well, actually just history. I'm fascinated by history and I love films about history and I think in turn that, ends up with, some of these films that have deep philosophical, tenets, right? And so um oftentimes I have film professors and people who kind of look at films more critically than maybe a general audience. But also I just have people on that are, experts on particular fields I like US history, and we talk about US history and stuff like that. So yeah, it's on YouTube. It's like a big playlist and every month is a new episode. And so like right now, for example, during the summer, um it's the summer and I literally do nothing. So I was like, well, let me just record a bunch of episodes and then when I go back to school, I'll just have them all ready. And so, film was one of those things. One of the, and one of the main reasons why I reached out to you was because I was so interested in philosophically looking at movies, and I'm kind of interested in, one of the greatest questions I always think about in my head is why do we do the things that we do? Like why, because it's easy to be like, well, that's just the way I am. Well, I think movies play a part in that. Um,
They
and
do. Yeah.
yeah, they just do. Movies have changed my life, whether I realize it or not. Um,
Mhm.
and also, I think Montana State is probably one of the greatest schools in the country. I'm a little biased there, but I do love Montana State. I just think it's cool. I just think how long have you lived in Montana and taught at MSU?
30 years.
Oh wow, yeah, wow, yeah,
Yeah, so it's been a while.
yeah, yeah. What made you come to Montana State or just Montana in general?
The simple answer is my wife got a job here,
Mm,
and I came and I finished my dissertation here the first couple of months we were here. And then I worked as an adjunct, teaching college writing and intro philosophy classes. And then eventually I became tenure track and became a regular faculty member after, uh, I don't know, that was 2000, so like 5 years.
wow.
And yeah, I mean, and so the simple answer is I followed my wife out here.
Yeah. No, I mean, whatever, whatever gets you to where you go, you just kind of end up there and you kind of look back on it.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird because you realize in retrospect, when you get older, that lots of things happen in your life that are tremendously important, but are really contingent. They're almost accidents.
Yeah.
And you don't do them intentionally so much as they just happen to you. And that's where luck comes in. I mean, you
Yeah.
is where you end up is a matter of luck as much as um, conscious choice.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. A lot of people, yeah, I could go on a whole tangent about it because I really do believe in luck. I highly doubt that wherever I get is mainly because of my purpose or talent or skill, but just because I'm just some random human being going through different events. But yeah, anyways, so all
Yeah.
right. Take care, Dan. Thanks for coming on here. I really do appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah,
All right. Have
great.
a good day. See ya.